On a freezing winter day, a kind waitress gave two hungry orphans a bowl of soup and lost her job for it. 20 years later, Alma Calder's quiet life is interrupted when a luxury car pulls up and two strangers step out. They're Ilan and Ziva, the children she once saved, now grown and successful. What they reveal will clear her name, expose the lies that ruined her, and prove that one small act of kindness can change everything. Alma hadn't had a visitor in 10 years when that Christmas Eve rolled around in 2023. Not since the town called her a thief. Not since the church called her worse. The whispers followed her like shadows in those days. And I watched from this very window as neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past her little house on Maple Street. But on that particular Christmas Eve night, when that black Audi purred up her broken driveway like a cat stalking prey, well, some debts don't stay buried forever. The two figures stepping out of that gleaming car carried the kind of reckoning that only comes when the hungry get fed and the liars get found. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating her old soup kitchen sign, hanging crooked on its rusty chain. Good Spoon, it had read once back when the letters weren't faded and the hope wasn't gone. The paint was peeling now, 20 years of weather having taken its toll. But somehow those words still held power, still meant something to folks who remembered. A man stepped out first, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from my window 3 houses down, I could see he was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. His gloved hand clutched something small and stained. My old eyes weren't what they used to be, but I could tell it was a napkin, old and yellowed with age. A napkin from 2003, as it would turn out. But why they'd waited 20 years to come back and why Cressida Vane's name was scribbled on that napkin in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, well, that's where our story truly begins. The woman who emerged from the passenger side moved with the grace of someone who'd fought battles and won them. Someone who'd learned that victory sometimes tastes like soup and sometimes like justice. Her hair caught the streetlight, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. But ghosts don't drive Audi, and ghosts don't carry briefcases full of legal documents. That would topple an empire built on the suffering of children. You see, December 17th, 2003 was the day Alma Calder lost her job and found her soul. I remember it clear as yesterday because that was the morning my Mabel Finch made her last batch of Christmas cookies before the cancer took her voice away. The snow was falling thick that morning, the kind that makes the whole world look clean, even when it's rotten underneath. From my kitchen window, I watched the flakes dance in the amber glow of the streetlights, each one perfect and unique, just like the souls we meet in this life. Alma had been working the morning shift at Nate's Diner over on Commerce Street, pouring coffee for truckers and serving up eggs that had seen better days. It was honest work for honest pay, and Alma had never asked for more than that. She was the kind of woman who said please and thank you to everyone, who remembered how customers liked their coffee, who slipped extra bacon to the construction workers who reminded her of her daddy. Nate's wasn't much to look at. Truth be told, the linoleum was cracked, the booths were held together with duct tape and prayer, and the coffee machine made sounds like a dying cat when it was brewing. But it was warm and it smelled like home cooking. And for folks who didn't have much of either, it was a sanctuary. Alma understood that. She'd made it her mission to make sure everyone who walked through those doors felt like they belonged somewhere, even if it was just for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. But then they walked in and everything changed. Ilan and Ziva, 7 and 9 years old, respectively, though their eyes looked decades older. They weren't beggars, mind you. Ghosts is what they were, with ribs like prison bars showing through. Their thin jackets and fingers so pale they looked translucent. Their shoes had holes that let the snow seep through, and Ziva kept stomping her feet to keep the feeling in her toes, making little squeaking sounds on the worn linoleum. They stood by the door like they weren't sure they were allowed to come in, their eyes taking in the warmth and the smell of food with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. Elon had his arm around his sister's shoulders, protective in the way that children learn to be when adults fail them. Ziva clutched a paper bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. When Alma saw them huddled by the door, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was their age. Standing in the kitchen of Sister Agatha Meyer's orphanage, watching the other children fight over scraps, she remembered the taste of watered-down gruel and the ache of going to bed with an empty stomach. She remembered Sister Agatha Meyer's ruler across her knuckles when she was caught stealing bread for the smaller children. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sister Agatha Meyer had been a woman who believed suffering built character, that hunger taught gratitude, and that children were born sinful and needed to be purged of their wickedness through deprivation. "Stealing bread gets you the closet," the old nun would say, her voice sharp as winter wind, her eyes cold as January frost. "But sharing it gets you the strap." Alma could still feel the welts that strap had left, could still remember the taste of her own blood when she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. But what Sister Agatha Meyer never understood was that every blow of that strap only strengthened Alma's resolve to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who saw hunger and filled it instead of using it as a weapon. Looking at these two children, Alma saw herself 30 years back, all hollow cheeks and desperate hope. Without a word, she moved to the soup pot and ladled out the biggest bowl the diner had. Thick with vegetables and chunks of beef that cost more than her hourly wage. The soup was her own recipe, something she'd been perfecting for months, adding herbs and spices she bought with her own money to make it taste like love felt warm. She slid the bowl across the counter along with a basket of crackers and 2 glasses of milk that she'd pay for herself if she had to. The milk was fresh and cold, the kind of white that promised nutrition and comfort. She added a pat of butter to the crackers, knowing that sometimes it's the small luxuries that remind us we're human. Ziva's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw that feast spread before them. She grabbed a handful of crackers and stuffed them in her sock with the quick, furtive movements of someone who'd learned that food was never guaranteed. "For later," she whispered, as if speaking too loud might make the bounty disappear like a mirage in the desert. Elon said nothing, just stared at that bowl like it was the Holy Grail itself. His hands shook as he picked up the spoon, and I imagine Alma could see the prayer of gratitude in his eyes, the kind of thanksgiving that comes from the very depths of the soul. When he took that first sip, his whole body relaxed for maybe the first time in months. Hank Brindle, the dishwasher who'd been working at Nate's since before televisions were color, shuffled over and watched the children eat. He was a man of few words, carved from granite and weathered by time. But when he did speak, folks listened. His hands were scarred from years of washing dishes in scalding water, and his back was bent from decades of standing over industrial sinks, but his eyes were sharp and kind. "Kid," he said to Alma, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you just fed 2 wolves. The problem is one's named Cressida. Now, Cressida Vane was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like jewelry, all shiny and displayed for the world to see. She managed the day shift at Nate's with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. And she had eyes like a hawk and twice the mean streak. She'd been watching Alma and those children from across the diner, her red lipstick pursed in disapproval that could freeze coffee in the cup. Cressida believed in rules the way some people believe in religion, with zealous fervor and no room for interpretation. There was a rule about not serving people who couldn't pay, a rule about portion control, a rule about everything that might interfere with the profit margin. She kept those rules written down in a little notebook she carried, adding new ones whenever she caught someone showing too much humanity. Her office was in the back of the diner, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The walls were covered with employee schedules, health department certificates, and photographs of Cressida with various local dignitaries. She kept a calculator on her desk at all times, constantly running numbers, always looking for ways to squeeze more profit from less investment. But Alma had learned something important in those orphanage years, something that Cressida would never understand. Kindness ain't free. It's a debt the world collects with interest, and the interest rate varies depending on how much love you put into the principal. And sure enough, as those children finished their soup and warmed their hands on the empty bowl, Cressida's scream cut through the diner like a knife through silk. "Where's the cash?" The tip jar was gone. $2,347 that Alma had been saving for her mother's Christmas present had vanished like smoke and wind. It wasn't much money, not to most folks. But to Alma, it represented hours of refilled coffee cups and patient smiles, small kindnesses that added up to something meaningful. Cressida's painted nails left moon-shaped cuts on Alma's arm as she grabbed her, her French manicure drawing blood from skin that had already been weathered by years of honest work. "I saw you with those little thieves," Cressida hissed. Her breath smelled of coffee, spite, and something rotten underneath. "You're all in it together, aren't you? Running some kind of scam on my diner." The accusation hit Alma like a physical blow. In all her years of working, in all her years of serving others, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all the hardships of her life. The one treasure that couldn't be stolen, lost, or broken. The police came within the hour, their boots heavy on the cracked linoleum. Their questions were sharp and suspicious. Officer Navarre was kind enough, but Officer Rook had the look of a man who'd already made up his mind before he walked through the door. They took statements from Cressida, from Hank Brindle, and from the 3 customers who'd been in the diner when the jar disappeared. The children were long gone by then, vanished into the December cold like they'd never existed at all. But the empty bowl remained on the counter, a testament to the meal that had started this whole chain of events. Alma stared at that bowl while the officers questioned her, wondering if she'd somehow brought this on herself by daring to show compassion. The manager came next, Alton Pritchard, a thin man who looked like he'd been pressed flat by the weight of corporate expectations. He'd been running Nate's for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never had an employee accused of theft. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, as if the very act of firing someone might contaminate him with their supposed dishonesty. By evening, there was a pink slip in Alma's locker and a notice that read "Terminated for theft" in Cressida's careful handwriting. But the real crime wasn't the missing money, though that stung deep enough. The real crime was that napkin, the one Alma had used to wipe Ziva's chin when the child had dripped soup down her jacket. Later, much later, Alma would remember the details that didn't make sense at the time. The way Cressida had lingered by the children's table after they'd left. The way she'd picked up that napkin and examined it closely before stuffing it in her apron pocket. The way she'd smiled when she thought no one was looking. A smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with satisfaction. That napkin had Cressida's lipstick print on it. Sure enough, but it also had something else. Numbers written in what looked like Alain's shaky child's handwriting. Numbers that, when arranged correctly, formed the combination to the diner's safe. Numbers that no customer should have known. Numbers that Cressida herself had written down and left carelessly on the counter that morning when she'd been rushing to make the bank deposit. The security cameras in Nate's were old and unreliable. And wouldn't you know it, the footage from 3:07 p.m. that afternoon was mysteriously corrupted. Technical malfunction, the company said when the police asked to review the tapes. Happens all the time with equipment that old. Hank knew better though. As Alma cleaned out her locker that night, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, he shuffled over with his characteristic limp and whispered words that would haunt her for years to come. "Cressida's brother runs the shelter those kids vanished from," he said, his eyes darting toward the kitchen where Cressida was counting the days with unusual thoroughness. "Funny how kids keep disappearing from there, and Jess keeps getting bonuses for operational efficiency." The fragments of a larger puzzle lay scattered around them, but Alma was too bruised and too stunned to fit them together yet. All she could dwell on was the wrongness of it all. How 20 years of honest labor could be wiped out by one act of compassion gone awry. That night, as Alma trudged home through snow that had shifted from lovely to perilous, she caught one last sight of Alon and Ziva. They were being ushered into a Child Protective Services van, their small bodies dwarfed by the official-looking adults encircling them. Ziva wept, her tears icing on her cheeks in the savage cold. But Ilan didn't cry at all. He stared straight at Alma through the rear window of that van. His young face was set with a resolve that seemed far too old for 7. His lips formed 2 words she would never forget. 2 words that would ring in her head for the next 20 years. "We'll return." The van rolled off into the dark, carrying those children back to whatever hell they'd escaped. And Alma stood beneath the falling snow, wondering whether she had just watched her own ruin or their morning brought news that froze Alma's blood and cracked her heart all over again. Good Spoon, the little soup kitchen she'd been planning with her savings, had been condemned by the city. The building she'd placed a deposit on, the spot where she meant to serve anyone who needed a meal, was suddenly deemed structurally unsound, according to an inspector's report that appeared overnight. Like mushrooms after rain. Though the report was signed by Inspector Kepler Shaw, who just happened to be married to Cressida's cousin. The condemnation order was co-signed by Deputy Mayor Silas Carradine, who just happened to be Cressida's new beau and would soon be her husband in a wedding the society pages would call the event of the season. Funny how love and politics make such convenient partners, how money and power swirl together like cream stirred into coffee. Alma's deposit, every cent saved over 5 years of double shifts and skipped meals, was forfeited under the lease's fine print. No refunds for acts of God or municipal action. Standing before that condemned shell on the morning of December 19, 2003, Alma felt something inside her chest go still. Not her kindness, not her will to help, but her faith in the system that was meant to protect people like her. The system that was supposed to reward work and punish those who preyed on the weak. The wrecking ball arrived that very afternoon, as if the city couldn't wait to erase every trace of Alma's hope. She stood among onlookers, watching 20 years of planning fall into dust and broken brick. The noise of destruction was deafening, yet she could still hear the echo of her own voice telling the bank officer how she would serve free meals to anyone who came through the door. As the dust settled and trucks hauled away debris, Alma noticed 2 familiar faces in the crowd. They weren't crying like neighbors who knew her plans. They weren't sad or sympathetic. They were counting. Their lips moved with each slab that fell, with each wall that failed, and Alma realized they were memorizing something crucial. Later, much later, she'd understand that Alon and Ziva were storing every detail of that ruin, filing it in young minds beside every injustice they'd seen, every cruelty they'd endured. They were building a case at 7 and 9 years old, gathering proof for a reckoning still 2 decades away. With no job and no prospects, no references and no chance in a town that believed she'd stolen, Alma's soup kitchen dream shrank into something humbler and more desperate. A shopping cart rescued from a grocery lot, a portable hot plate from a thrift store, a wobbly card table sturdy enough to bear the weight of hope. She set it all beneath the Morrison Street Bridge where homeless veterans gathered, and the city's forgotten found cover from the weather and respectable eyes. The concrete walls bloomed with graffiti telling stories of love and loss, of deferred dreams and broken promises. Yet there was beauty. 2 murals by artists who knew that honest art sometimes rises from the darkest places. The veterans became her guardians. Men and women who'd seen too much war and too little peace, who knew what it meant to be discarded by a country that once called them heroes. Sergeant Theo Marquez had lost his left leg in Desert Storm and his family to the long road back. Nurse Ada Fenwick had served 3 tours in Vietnam and returned to a nation that spat on her uniform and forgot her name. "You fed my kid, lady," Sergeant Theo Marquez told her one bitter January night, his eyes gentle despite the scars that mapped his face. Jimmy was one of those kids you used to slip extra pancakes to on Sundays. "Now we feed you." They formed a protective ring around her makeshift kitchen broken. Soldiers who'd learned the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with compassion. They hauled water, shared cans from their meager stores, and kept watch while she cooked, making sure no one troubled the woman who chose to feed others when she could barely feed herself. In the dented recipe box she carried, sealed in plastic against the rain, Alma kept more than instructions. Every napkin with a thank you, every scrap where someone wrote a name to prove they existed, every small token from people she'd fed. The box became a ledger of human dignity, proof that kindness given returns with interest. There were letters from truckers who remembered her coffee, from college kids who scraped change for a finals week meal, from single mothers who brought their children to Nate's because it was the only place they could afford to eat out. Each slip told a story, and each story mattered. Buried at the bottom, wrapped like a relic, was a photograph she'd found riding the wind after the wrecking crew finished. Someone had dropped it or tossed it, thinking no one would care. But Alma cared, and what she saw turned her blood to ice. It showed Cressida passing the thick envelope to Orson Gant, the CPS director. Both of them smiling like they had just closed a particularly profitable deal. They were standing outside the Cedar Ridge group home, the same facility where Elin and Ziva had supposedly been living before they wandered into Nate's that December morning. The timestamp on the photo read 2003, one day after Elin and Ziva had disappeared back into the system. One day after Alma had lost everything she'd worked for. One day after Cressida Vane had gotten exactly what she wanted. For 10 long years, Alma ladled soup from that shopping cart under the Morrison Street Bridge. She served construction workers who were between jobs, college students whose financial aid had run out, runaways who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. She fed retired teachers whose pensions had been stolen, disabled veterans waiting for benefits that might never come, and immigrant families whose dreams of America had run headfirst into the reality of poverty. Each bowl of soup carried a story, and each story carried weight that settled in Alma's bones like sediment in a river. She began to understand that she wasn't just feeding bodies. She was feeding souls, nourishing the part of humanity that society had forgotten or abandoned. But late at night, when the bridge was empty except for the sound of traffic overhead and the whistle of wind through the steel girders, Alma would sometimes wonder if she was really saving souls or just drowning her own shame in an endless sea of hunger that could never be fully satisfied. The doubt crept in during the hardest times when the police would come and tell them to move along, when city officials would confiscate her cart for health code violations, and when well-meaning citizens would complain about the unsightly gathering of desperate people in their clean, safe neighborhood. Some nights she'd lie on her cot in the women's shelter and wonder if Cressida Vane had been right, if she really was just enabling people who should be taking care of themselves. But then morning would come, and someone would approach her cart with hollow eyes and empty hands, and Alma would remember why she'd started doing this in the first place. Soup isn't just food, she'd learn. It's evidence. Evidence that someone saw you when the world looked away. Evidence that you mattered when everything else said you didn't. Evidence that love can be measured by the tablespoon and served up hot when everything else has gone cold. The years passed like seasons, each one bringing new faces and familiar hungers. Alma's hair grew gray, then white, and her hands developed arthritis from constantly stirring pots and ladling soup. Her back bent from carrying water jugs and folding tables, and her feet grew flat from standing on concrete for hours at a time. But her smile never wavered, her ladle never emptied, and her faith in the basic goodness of people somehow survived every cruelty the world threw at her. Then came the fire that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in March 2013, 10 years, almost to the day since she'd lost her job at Nate's. Alma had just finished serving lunch to about 40 people when Dax Harlan, a veteran who'd been struggling with addiction and demons that had names but no solutions, stumbled too close to the propane tank with a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. The explosion wasn't large, but it was fast and hungry. The flames ate through her makeshift kitchen like a living thing, consuming months of careful organization in a matter of minutes. The shopping cart, the hot plate, the card table that had been her altar of service, all of it turned to ash and twisted metal before the fire department could respond. But the cruelest loss was that recipe box with its precious collection of human dignity. 20 years of thank you notes and napkin testimonials. 20 years of proof that her work had mattered. 20 years of evidence that kindness given is kindness returned. All of it burned while Alma stood helpless and watched the smoke carry her life's work up into the gray March sky. Dax was burned badly, with second-degree burns on his arms and face. And as the ambulance took him away, he kept apologizing through lips that were cracked and blistered. "I'm sorry, Miss Alma," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." But even in her grief, even watching everything she'd built turn to ash, Alma took his burned hand in hers and said, "It's okay, honey. Things can be replaced." "You can't be." The fire department investigator, a kind woman named Captain Cardenas, found Alma sitting on a piece of broken concrete, staring at the remains of her kitchen with dry eyes and a heavy heart. "I'm sorry for your loss," Cardenas said, and she meant it. She'd seen enough fires to know the difference between someone losing possessions and someone losing purpose. But not everything had burned. In the deepest corner of that metal box, protected by layers of plastic and Alma's careful planning, one item had survived the flames. A business card, its edges singed, but its printing still legible. Vane Holdings, creating solutions for tomorrow's challenges. The card was cream-colored, expensive, the kind of stationery that whispered of power and influence. On the back, in handwriting that Alma didn't recognize, someone had scrawled, "See her home, monthly payments. Keep quiet." The words were faded but readable, and they made Alma's pulse quicken with the first hope she'd felt in years. Cedar Ridge Group Home, where Elan and Ziva had disappeared to 20 years ago. Monthly payments that could mean only one thing. Someone was being paid to keep quiet about whatever was happening in that place. And the business card belonged to Cressida Vane's company, the empire she'd built on the ashes of other people's dreams. That card became Alma's obsession, her North Star, her reason for getting up every morning and figuring out how to rebuild what the fire had taken. She spent long nights at the public library scrolling through public records and tax documents until her eyes burned from staring at the computer screen. The librarian, Mrs. Kwan, an elderly woman who remembered when libraries were sanctuaries for anyone seeking knowledge, would bring Alma cups of coffee and gentle reminders to take breaks. "You're looking for something specific," Mrs. Kwan observed one evening as Alma rubbed her tired eyes. It wasn't a question. "Justice," Alma replied simply. "I'm looking for justice." The financial records she found made her stomach turn with a sickness that went deeper than hunger. Vane Holdings' tax returns for the past decade told a story that was both complex and horrifyingly simple. Buried in schedules and addendums, hidden behind corporate speak and accounting terminology, was evidence of a system designed to profit from human misery. Dining solutions, $12,000 per month from Cedar Ridge Group Home. Read line 47 of their 2012 tax return. The same amount appeared every year, always from the same source, always categorized as consulting fees for nutritional program management. Cedar Ridge Group Home, the same place where Elan and Ziva's paperwork had been lost. The same facility that had a suspiciously high number of runaways who were never reported missing to the authorities. The same institution that had been receiving state funding for housing and feeding children who according to official records, didn't exist. The deeper Alma dug, the sicker the whole thing became. Cedar Ridge was supposedly a temporary placement facility for children awaiting permanent homes, but the average stay was over 3 years. The facility received $400 per child per day from the state, money earmarked for housing, education, medical care, and nutrition. But the children weren't being educated. They were working in industrial kitchens preparing meals for other state institutions. They weren't receiving medical care. They were being treated by a nurse practitioner who'd lost her license in 2 other states for falsifying medical records. And they certainly weren't being properly fed. The nutritional budgets were being diverted to Vane Holdings for consulting services that seemed to consist primarily of teaching hungry children how to prepare food they weren't allowed to eat. The paper trail led through a maze of shell companies and dummy corporations. But at the center of it all was Cressida Vane, now Cressida Vane since her marriage to the deputy mayor. She'd built an empire on the systematic abuse of the most vulnerable members of society. And she'd done it with the blessing and protection of local government officials who were either too corrupt to care or too incompetent to notice. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Not even me, with all my years of watching human nature play out in the theater of life. Those children, Ilan and Ziva, they hadn't just survived the hell that Cressida and her brother had put them through. They'd thrived in ways that would have made even the most optimistic social worker weep with joy. Ilan had built a company called Nourish, starting with nothing but a smartphone app and a determination to make sure no child ever went hungry the way he had. By 2020, Nourish was delivering free meals to food deserts across the country, partnering with restaurants to rescue surplus food and redirect it to families in need. The company was worth more than Vane Holdings had ever dreamed of being, and every penny of profit was reinvested in feeding programs. Ziva had become a different kind of warrior, fighting her battles in courtrooms instead of kitchens. She specialized in cases that nobody else would touch. Children who'd been failed by the system, families destroyed by bureaucratic indifference, individuals whose voices had been silenced by those in power. Her law firm, Calder and Associates, was named in honor of a diner worker who'd shown her kindness when the world had shown her nothing but cruelty. They had a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning them through sheer determination and an intimate understanding of how institutions fail the people they're meant to protect. For 20 years, they've been watching Cressida Vane, gathering evidence like spiders spinning webs. Every government contract, every falsified report, every child who disappeared into her system and emerged broken or not at all was all documented, cataloged, and prepared for the day when justice would finally come calling. They'd been patient because they'd learned early that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected, aged like fine wine until it's powerful enough to topple empires built on suffering. They'd learned to think not in days or months, but in decades, planning their moves like chess masters who could see 20 moves ahead. The Audi that pulled up to Alma's house that Christmas Eve wasn't theirs, at least not originally. It had belonged to Cressida Vane, purchased with money that should have gone to feed hungry children, driven to charity galas where Cressida accepted awards for her dedication to helping at-risk youth. The title was in the glove compartment now, signed over to Alma Calder, along with the deed to a building downtown that was worth more than all the soup kitchens in the world. But money wasn't why they'd come. Money was just the tool, just the means to an end that had been 20 years in the making. They'd come to deliver something far more valuable: vindication, justice, and the sweet satisfaction of watching Cressida Vane finally face the consequences of 20 years of cruelty disguised as charity. Ziva stepped out of that Audi looking like the liar she'd become, confident and professional. But when she saw Alma through the window, her composure cracked just a little. For a moment, she was 9 years old again, clutching a paper bag that held everything she owned, grateful beyond words for a bowl of soup and a kind word from a stranger who'd chosen to see her. Humanity when everyone else saw only a problem to be managed. Elon moved like a man who'd learned to be careful with his power, who understood that true strength comes not from domination, but from service. In his hand was that napkin, the one that had started this whole chain of events 20 years ago. It was wrapped in plastic now, preserved like the evidence it had always been, ready to tell its story to anyone willing to listen. The press called it the soup kitchen scandal. When the story finally broke in January 2024, though those of us who'd been paying attention knew it was so much more than that. It was a reckoning 20 years in the making, a reminder that the arc of the moral universe might bend toward justice, but sometimes it needs a helping hand to bend it in the right direction. Cressida Vane stood on the courthouse steps in her designer suit and pearls, declaring her innocence to anyone with a camera or a microphone. She spoke of disgruntled former employees and ungrateful charity cases, of a conspiracy by people who couldn't understand the complexities of running social service programs. Her lawyer, an expensive man in expensive suit, talked about the presumption of innocence and the dangers of trial by media. But words are just air until they're backed up by evidence, and the evidence that Ziva and Elon had compiled over 2 decades was devastating in its scope and damning in its detail. Financial records showed money meant for children's meals being diverted to personal accounts. Medical records revealed systematic neglect and abuse. Employment records showed children as young as 8 being used as unpaid labor in commercial kitchens. The recording that Ziva played for the packed courtroom was 20 years old, but the digital restoration technology that Elon's company had developed made every word as clear as if it had been spoken yesterday. Cressida's voice, younger but just as cold, outlined her plan to use the group home children as free labor while collecting full payment for their care. "Those kids are worth more working than eating," Cressida's recorded voice said with clinical detachment. "Let them think that soup kitchen woman stole their money. Keeps them grateful and keeps them quiet. And if any of them get too mouthy, well, we can always arrange for them to disappear into the system somewhere else. Who's going to miss a couple of throwaway kids?" The community revolt that followed was something to see. An uprising of conscience that reminded everyone why democracy sometimes works despite itself. Homeless families stormed the city council chambers, carrying signs with Alma's picture and testimonials about meals she'd served under that bridge. Former group home residents, now adults with families of their own, came forward with stories that made hardened reporters weep. "She fed us," they chanted, their voices echoing off the marble walls of power, bouncing back at the politicians who'd enabled Cressida's system of abuse through their willful blindness and corrupt complicity. "She fed us when nobody else would. She saw us when nobody else cared." The mayor, faced with overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity in 20 years of systematic child abuse, called an emergency press conference where he announced his immediate resignation. The deputy mayor, Cressida's husband, was arrested before he could follow suit. The city council voted unanimously to void every contract Vane Holdings had ever received, and the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation that would eventually reach into dozens of similar facilities across the region. But Elon's testimony was the bomb that leveled Cressida's empire entirely. The killing blow was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for 20 years. His forensic accounting, backed up by teams of investigators and data analysts, proved that Vane Holdings had embezzled $2.8 million from school lunch programs over the past decade. Money meant to feed children was redirected to Cressida's personal accounts, vacation homes, and luxury cars. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost that truly broke hearts in that courtroom. Elon spoke in a voice that remained steady despite the tears streaming down his face, describing how he and his sister had been forced to work 16-hour days in commercial kitchens, preparing thousands of meals for school districts while being fed nothing but thin gruel and stale bread. "We made food for other children while we starved," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain. We prepared birthday cakes for school celebrations while we forgot what cake tasted like. We packaged lunches for field trips we would never take to places we would never see, for childhoods we would never have. Ziva's testimony was equally devastating, but delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize her pain in service of justice. She detailed the systematic abuse that went beyond mere hunger, describing how children who complained or asked questions were punished with solitary confinement, how medical care was withheld as a form of control, and how education was replaced with labor that generated profit for Cressida's empire. "They didn't just steal our food," Ziva said, her voice cutting through the silence of the packed courtroom like a blade through cloth. "They stole our childhoods, our health, our futures. They turned us into commodities, bought and sold and traded like livestock. And when we dared to dream of something better, when we dared to believe we deserved more than scraps and cruelty, they made sure we knew our place." The climax came on the third day of testimony, when Cressida, finally realizing that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a house built on sand, lunged across the courtroom at Alma in a final act of desperate rage. She moved like a woman possessed, her face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred for the person who'd shown kindness when Cressida had demanded only submission. But Alma, weathered by 20 years of serving soup to desperate people and strengthened by decades of choosing love over fear, caught Cressida's wrist with hands that remained steady despite everything she'd endured. The courtroom held its breath as these two women faced each other across 20 years of pain and injustice. Predator and prey switched roles in a moment that felt like cosmic justice finally asserting itself. "You starved them," Alma said, her voice calm as still water, carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You took children who had nothing, and you gave them less than nothing. You turned their hunger into your profit, and their pain into your pleasure. I saved you the trouble of having a conscience." The judge, a stern woman who'd seen too many cases of institutional abuse, but never one quite this systematic, sentenced Cressida to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to every child who'd been harmed by her operation. The amount was staggering, over $40 million when accounting for lost wages, medical costs, psychological damage, and punitive damages. But money, as important as it was, couldn't undo 20 years of trauma. What mattered more was the symbolic victory, the knowledge that someone had finally been held accountable for treating children like commodities instead of human beings. What mattered was the message sent to every other Cressida vein operating in the shadows, that their time of reckoning would come. The mayor, faced with his own corruption charges and overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity, held one final press conference before disappearing into federal protection and a plea deal that would keep him out of prison in exchange for his cooperation. At that conference, with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with something that might have been genuine remorse, he tore up every eviction notice his office had ever served against Alma's various soup kitchens. And Elan, tears streaming down his face as he watched 20 years of planning finally come to fruition, handed Alma a key. Not to the Audi, though that came with it. Not to cash, though there was plenty of that as well. The key unlocked something far more precious, the closing of a circle that began with a bowl of soup on a snowy December morning. 6 months later, in the center of downtown, the new Good Spoon opened, gleaming like a fine restaurant, yet run like a mission. The structure had once been Cressida's nerve center, the place she mapped an empire of exploitation. Now it thrummed with industrial mixers, turning out soup for anyone who needed it. The kitchen was modern to the last hinge, built to serve 500 meals a day, yet shaped around dignity. The dining room looked like a real bistro, tablecloths, flowers, soft music in the background. No lines, no tickets, no humiliations, meant to make hunger feel like a crime. Just chairs and tables and servers who knew that food is love you can see. A gold plaque at the entrance said simply, "No one leaves hungry." Underneath, In smaller type, most people missed unless they leaned in, were the words that mattered most. In memory of every child who went to bed hungry and in hope that no child ever will again. Even Cressida, doing community service in the kitchen during the first year of her sentence on a work release program, learned something about the honor of real labor and the relief of feeding people instead of feeding on them. She said little, her designer wardrobe traded for a plain apron, her polished nails split by honest work. At first, she moved through tasks with sulky compliance, following steps without grasping the purpose. Then, slowly something shifted. Maybe it was the gratitude in people's eyes. Maybe it was finally understanding what it means to give rather than take. Or maybe it was the long wait of 2 decades of guilt at last finding a place to be put down. One evening, as they latched the doors, Cressida came to Alma with something that looked like an apology clawing its way past lips unused to such words. "I don't know how to apologize for 20 years, she whispered. Alma studied her, this woman who'd built profit on pain and then pressed a ladle into her hand. "Start with tomorrow's soup." Jiva adopted a small girl from Cedar Ridge Group Home when the place was shuttered. A child with hollow eyes and twig-thin arms, a living echo of 2 orphans who had stepped into a diner 20 years before. She had been warehoused for 3 years, passed from bed to bed, failed by each system meant to guard her. "Her name's Alma," Ziva announced at the grand opening, the child clutching her hand like a rope while she took in the warmth and plenty of the new good spoon with eyes that doubted their own joy. "And she's going to grow up knowing that there are people who will feed her when she's hungry and hold her when she's afraid." No one missed the symbolism. The wheel had turned. Hurt became healing. Suffering became purpose. The child would grow in a world where Cressida Vane's machine had been replaced by Alma Calder's legacy, where the same building that once maximized profit from misery now offered hot meals to anyone who asked. Hank Brindle, 94 now and still sharp despite the bent back and the slow steps, came to the grand opening leaning hard on a walker and refusing every chair. He had outlasted Nate's diner, outlasted 3 owners, outlasted his own expectations for how long a dishwasher can run on grit and spite. He shuffled to Alma, eyes bright behind clouded cataracts, and delivered his verdict on 2 decades of struggle and grace. "Kid," he rasped, still rough as sandpaper dragged over concrete, "you fed the wolves." And they remembered. Funny how giving flips the world. But the loveliest moment arrived on a snowy December night, exactly 20 years after that first bowl that set everything in motion. Alma was closing the kitchen when a pure, sweet humming drifted from the dining room and made the air itself seem to glow. Ziva sat there lawyer now and mother softly singing, "You Are My Sunshine," while her daughter colored at a table. The child used bright yellow crayons to draw a bowl of soup, steam spiraling into little musical notes. "My grandmother sang that at the first orphanage," Ziva said when she noticed Alma in the doorway. "Before the hunger got so loud we forgot how to sing. Before music became a luxury we couldn't afford. You gave that back. The memory of joy. Permission to hope." Alma's eyes filled with tears she'd been saving for 20 years, brine that tasted of vindication, sorrow, and thanks. All those nights of doubt, wondering whether she'd done the right thing, whether one bowl could matter in a world so bluntly cruel. Here was the answer, humming in warm light over a kitchen filled with hope instead of hunger. The old recipe box had burned long ago, but Alma had learned the real recipes are never on paper. They pass heart to heart, one hungry soul to another, in the simple act of seeing need and deciding to fill it. They're measured not in cups and spoons, but in courage and compassion, seasoned with justice and served with the knowledge that we're only stewards of whatever abundance we're given. Feed one mouth, you save a body. Feed a soul, you save a lineage. As I finish, sitting in my chair by the window where I've watched the world change for nearly a century, I can see the good spoon from here. The lights stay on. The door is never locked. Steam lifts from the kitchen like prayers rising. The building glows in December, dark a beacon for anyone who needs proof that kindness still lives in a world that sometimes forgets how to care. Some nights, when the snow hushes the streets and the wind threads the bare branches, a yellowed memory pulls up in the form of a Audi. Two figures get out. Not the hollow-eyed children they once were, but capable adults who remember exactly where they came from and who helped them survive the worst hours. They roll up their sleeves and serve whoever needs a bowl, faces lit with the same mercy Alma showed them long ago. Elon, late 20s now, moves with the rhythm of someone who learned early how rare food can be. He's grown Nourish to 12 cities, partnering with people once unhoused to run local teams, hiring those who understand hunger from the inside. The company doesn't just deliver food. It delivers dignity, respect, the radical idea that everyone deserves to eat well regardless of their ability to pay. Ziva works the policy front, crafting laws with local leaders so children's well-being outranks. Institutional convenience, more oversight for group homes, stronger nutrition funding, harsher penalties for anyone profiting from abuse. Together, they built a foundation bearing Alma's name, seeding grants for soup kitchens and pantries across the country. More than money, though, they give something you can't invoice: hope. Hope that systems can turn, that justice can win, that kindness planted in darkness can bloom into something bright and durable. Even the Audi has become a legend. The neighborhood watched as Elon had it repainted from black to sunlit yellow, and Ziva added free meals inside in letters no one could miss. It's no longer just a car. It's a rolling witness to redemption, a reminder that the tools of the corrupt can be remade into instruments of care. And sometimes, if the wind is right and the night holds still, you can hear something floating out of that kitchen. Not only the clink of ladles or the simmer of broth, but something else. Something that sounds like hope, like mending, like the echo of a 9-year-old humming, "You are my sunshine," while she draws bowls of soup and dreams of a world where no child goes to bed hungry. The veterans under the Morrison Street Bridge still gather now and then, though most have housing thanks to programs Ziva pushed into being. They come to the Good Spoon not for the meal, but for the memory of a woman who used a shopping cart and a hot plate to teach dignity right alongside nutrition. Sergeant Theo Marquez, his prosthetic now state-of-the-art thanks to benefits. Ziva helped untangle works part-time as the Good Spoon's guard. Not because it needs protection, but because he wants to safeguard the woman who once guarded him when he had nothing left but hunger and pride, too stubborn to ask for help. Nurse Ada Fenwick, the Vietnam veteran nurse, runs the Good Spoon's medical clinic, providing basic health care to anyone who walks through the doors. She's seen too much suffering to turn anyone away, and she understands that hunger and illness are often partners in the dance of poverty. Her clinic operates on the same principle as Alma's kitchen. No questions asked, no judgment passed, just help given to whoever needs it. The anniversary of that first bowl of soup has become an unofficial holiday in the neighborhood. A day when the community comes together to remember that individual acts of kindness can echo through decades. The celebration isn't grand or elaborate. It's just a shared meal where everyone sits at the same table, where the served become the servers, where former enemies break bread together in a ritual of reconciliation that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Cressida, now 3 years into her sentence and genuinely transformed by the experience of serving others, wrote a letter that Alma keeps framed on her office wall. It's not an eloquent document. Cressida was never much with words when they weren't being used as weapons, but it's sincere in a way that cuts through all the legal language and courtroom drama to touch something essential about human nature's capacity for change. "I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's hunger," the letter reads in Cressida's careful handwriting. "I convinced myself I was helping, that I was providing structure and discipline to children who needed guidance. But I was really just feeding my own hunger for power and control. You showed me the difference between taking and giving, between using people and serving them. I can't undo 20 years of damage, but I can try to spend the rest of my life balancing the scales. The letter goes on to detail Cressida's plans for when she's released, her intention to use her business skills to support organizations like the Good Spoon, her commitment to making amends, not just through restitution, but through service. It signs simply Cressida Carradine, as if she's finally learning to take responsibility for both parts of her identity instead of hiding behind titles and married names. So, next time you pass a soup kitchen or see someone hungry on the street, or encounter a small act of kindness that seems insignificant in the grand scheme of things, remember Alma Calder and 2 orphan children who learned that love can be ladled from a bowl and served with crackers on the side. Listen close. You might just hear your name in the steam calling you to remember that in a world full of Cressida veins, we all have the choice to be Alma Calder instead. The choice to see hunger and fill it, to see loneliness and warm it, to see despair and offer it a seat at the table where everyone is welcome. And no one leaves empty, because that's the thing about soup kitchens, you see. They're not really about the soup at all. They're about the kitchen part. The place where strangers become family, where the broken get mended one meal at a time, and where ordinary people discover they have the power to change the world one bowl at a time. That torn apron Alma wore during those bridge years now hangs framed in the new Good Spoon kitchen. A reminder that sometimes the most important uniform is the one stained with service to others. Every morning when the staff arrives to begin preparing the day's meals, they touch that frame for luck, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who proved that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through decades, can transform lives, can literally move mountains of indifference and create valleys of compassion where none existed before. The recipe for that first bowl of soup, the one that started this whole chain of events, has been recreated and perfected by the Good Spoon's head chef, a former Food Network star who gave up his television career to serve meals to people who couldn't pay for them. It's called Alma's Special, and it's made with ingredients that can't be measured: a cup of compassion, a tablespoon of hope, a generous portion of human dignity, and love enough to feed anyone who's hungry. Every bowl served carries that same energy, that same intention, that same refusal to accept that anyone should go hungry in a world of abundance. The steam that rises from those bowls carries more than just the aroma of vegetables and broth. It carries the promise that someone cares, that someone sees you, that someone believes you deserve to be fed regardless of your circumstances or your ability to reciprocate. The Good Spoon now has 7 locations across 3 states, each one staffed partially by people who were once served there. People who understand hunger from the inside and refuse to let others experience what they experienced. The model has been replicated by other organizations, creating a network of compassion that stretches across the country like a web of hope. But it all started with one woman who saw 2 hungry children and decided that rules mattered less than hunger, that profit mattered less than people, that her own comfort mattered less than someone else's desperate need. It started with a choice that seemed small at the time, but rippled outward like circles on a pond, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. And as I sit here in my chair, watching the snow fall outside my window on another December evening, I can see those circles still rippling outward. I can see the Good Spoon's warm lights cutting through the darkness, promising warmth and sustenance to anyone who needs it. I can see the yellow Audi parked outside, its cheerful color a deliberate rejection of the darkness it once represented. Most importantly, I can see hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that individual acts of kindness matter in ways we may never fully understand. Hope that in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush the vulnerable, there will always be people like Alma Calder who choose compassion over convenience, service over self-interest, love over fear. The steam still rises from that kitchen every night, carrying with it the prayers of the fed and the hopes of the hungry. And somewhere in that steam, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the voice of every soul who was touched by kindness when they needed it most. You can hear them saying thank you. You can hear them saying they remember. You can hear them promising to pass it on. And in a world that too often forgets the power of simple human decency, that promise echoes louder than any symphony, more beautiful than any song, as enduring as the love that first filled a bowl with soup and changed the world one spoonful at a time.